Thanks for coming inside today. My name's Bob Foster. I'm the director at the Hoboken Historical Museum. It's kind of gutsy to do a lecture in August in the dog days of summer and have people come inside and all that. But we have found that if you have a great speaker and you have a great program, build it and they will come. So thank you so much for coming in. This is the first lecture of a 10-part series that will take us from August 21st today until May of 2017. So I'm going to sort of put a challenge here. I'm going to give a special prize to anyone who attends all 10 lectures. So I'm just sort of doing a facial recognition thing to see if, we have who we have in the room. But we do have a full house. I got a feeling this will grow from word of mouth. So very happy that we, have a nice crowd here today. Our subject today is the Black Tom explosion, which how many people have heard of? Wow, this is an educated crowd. We think about, when we think about Hoboken in World War I, there's sort of that big, heaven, hell, or Hoboken sort of battle cry, which most of us know. We might not even understand what it means or where it came from, but Hoboken is strongly associated with, shall we say, the point of embarkation and debarkation of the troops. Over 2 million men have believed to have come through Hoboken and returned to Hoboken, and of course the folks who, were casualties in the war are included in that number. So that's usually what we dwell on for World War I. But for this lecture today, we're talking a very specific event that happened 100 years ago, going back to June 30th. I've lived in the area since the early 1980s, and I had heard about the Black Tom explosion, but it was never even put into the context of World War I. I never really knew about it. And then when I first read Chad's book, The Detonators, in 2006, I believe, I could not believe this story. I'm a firm believer of not believing in conspiracy theories, but this is one event that will kind of shake your sense of security from government and sort of a whole backstory that you would never know about. So I'll introduce Chad in a second. I did just want to really give a real big shout out, thank you to our funders for this project, the New Jersey Historical Commission, which is our patron saint for funding, not only for GOS support, which helps pay for the lights, but also embarking on a special project like this, the lecture series. They've come through for us many, many times. We've also have support from Hudson County Cultural Affairs, Bill LaRosa's office, through the county executive, Tom DeGeese. And we also have support from the World War I Commission, which makes up many different entities, which are all listed on our poster. So really a big thank you for all those funders. So, again, I'm not going to give any more history on the Black Tom. That's what Chad is here for. So let's give the warmest thank you for him coming here. Let's welcome Chad Millman. Thank you very much, Chad.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everyone, for coming out on Sunday, like Bob said. I'm thrilled to be the first lecturer in the series. I didn't realize that it was going to go on for so long, so that's pretty fantastic. As Bob said, it is the 100th anniversary of the attack on Black Tom Island, which was the subject of my book, The Detonators, which came out 10 years ago, so I was about 10 years too early. But when I read the story, I was very anxious. I found the story, I had just finished a book. I'm a sports writer by trade and by training, and I had just finished a book where I had spent 6 months in Las Vegas tracking guys who bet on sports for a living and trying to sort of convince them to tell me how much they're betting and what are they betting on and why are they betting and tell me about some of the illegal things that they're doing. And so I knew I wanted to write another book, and I always liked sort of narrative nonfiction history, and I read a lot about it, and I read a lot of narrative nonfiction history books. And so I knew that sort of it would be easier to convince dead people to tell me their stories than people who were still living and doing their work. So I had gone through, I was living in Manhattan at the time on 57th Street between Lex and 3rd, and it was 2003, and so it was 2 years after 9/11. And I had gone through one of these on this date in history websites, and basically started at 1900 and looked at January 1st, 1900, and then went to January 2nd, 1900. And, you know, this was the better part of several weeks, just like every day reading a little bit more and like reading these 2-line descriptions of what was happening in the United States on these particular days. And I got to, eventually I got to 1916. It was July 30th, 1916. And the 2-line entry was German saboteurs blow up New York Harbor. Much of downtown Manhattan is destroyed. And I'm, you know, we're almost 2 years removed from 9/11, and I'm living in the middle of Manhattan, and I could not believe I had never heard this story before. It was stunning to me. So I did a little more research and did some digging, and there hadn't been much written about this in contemporary media. And the more I read about it, the more fascinating it was. The more I realized that there were characters who went on to have major impact in sort of the world at large, who were focal points of both this investigation and what happened, and discovering who had actually committed this act of terror. And if you go to the spot in Jersey City, it's in Liberty State Park now, there is a plaque in one of the parks there that says this is the site of the first act of terrorism in the United States, and it sort of commemorates it in that way. But what I wanted to do today was I'm going to read some excerpts from some chapters in the book. And it'll take about 20, 25 minutes. And then at the end, I will answer any and all questions that anybody may have about the event or the history around the event or sort of the repercussions post-event. So thank you very much. If I'm holding it tight here, it's because my eyes are very bad, and so I can't see it very well. Okay. So this first section is from chapter 1, and I chose it because it explains why sort of this area, both the harbor itself and sort of the surrounding areas, both in Lower Manhattan and in this side of Jersey City, are so important to Germany's plans. Because when Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, declared the U.S. was neutral, he not only sort of refused to commit American troops to the war, but he refused to let the dozens of German ships that were already in American ports go back out to sea and sort of become a part of the war effort. So what you had was dozens, if not hundreds, of German sailors interned in the United States, and sort of that internment became paramount to Germany's plans and really started to foster resentment and ill will for America's policy of neutrality and sort of the idea that Americans were hypocrites, because while Wilson refused to allow America to join the war and then refused to allow German ships to go back to fight, he never stopped American private companies from selling munitions to anybody who could pay the highest price. And at the time, the places that could pay the highest price were the British and the French military. Germany was remarkably poor, was lacking in resources. The Kaiser had decided that bullets could not be used in target practice because they had to ration for when they were actually in the front. So it caused a lot of sort of anger amongst the Germans who were living here at the time. So here's something from the first chapter of the book. Heinrich Albert was 40 years old, carried a briefcase, and worked in an office high above Broadway in one of downtown Manhattan's brand new skyscrapers. From his window, he could see West Street, crowded with merchants leading horse-drawn carts of fruit, dock workers pulling on pieces of bread while on their way to the piers, and policemen walking their beats. He watched as cargo ships hauling grain and coal were emptied onto the covered piers stretching out into New York Harbor. 99 of them on the west side of Manhattan, ranging from 600 feet to 1,000 feet long. Originally built to accommodate ocean liners like the Lusitania and the Olympic, the piers were too important to use just for luxury travelers. By 1914, more material moved in and out of New York Harbor than anywhere else in the world. The mayor at the time, John Mitchell, worried aloud about the economic consequences worldwide if someone demolished his harbor, and not a soul considered his fears without justification. The scene was always so hurried, so full of purpose, so earnest, so typically American, Albert thought, how he hated the view. Past the piers, the Statue of Liberty glistened in the late afternoon sun. Every day, immigrants from Europe, refugees from the war, arrived nearby at Ellis Island. Albert himself was a stranger here, having moved to New York shortly after the conflict in Europe had begun in August 1914. He had come alone, leaving his wife and their 3 young children in Germany. On a clear day, if he squinted, Albert could see beyond the Statue of Liberty to Black Tom Island, a mile-long spit jutting into the harbor from Jersey City. Black Tom was laid with dozens of intricately woven tracks and long piers extending like spokes from off one side of the thin finger of land. From sunrise to sunset, workers unloaded trains that brought dangerous cargo from all over the country, transferring the goods to the ships waiting in the piers. The largest munitions depot in the country, Black Tom was the last stop for American-made shells, dynamite, and bullets before they were sent to the front. The British and the French were buying them by the ton, as fast as the American companies could make them, and then using them to beat back the Germans in the countryside of France and off the coasts of Europe. Directly in front of the piers, running parallel to the river, was West Street. So hurried in the light of the day, it lay still after dark, littered with grain and loose pieces of coal that had fallen from carts, water pooled in the crevices between the cobblestones. There were no lights along the docks, and the only sounds came from small waves on the Hudson River slapping against the hulls of ships. In the night shadows, resentful, interned German seamen, loud, bored, and frustrated, stumbled along West Street, tripping on the uneven lane, drawing rebukes from the cops walking the beat. The Germans spent their days maintaining their ships, scraping down the sides, watching the steamers leave wispy trails as they chugged away from Black Tom, headed for the war. Nights were spent wandering and drinking. They weren't prisoners, but they weren't free. No matter where they went, they were viewed with suspicion. All who found themselves dockside at midnight were to be doubted. Said Thomas Tunney, then the head of the New York City Police Department's bomb squad, quote, "In districts where you find people, you will rarely find lights, and where there are no lights, you may well expect crime. On the waterfront, for every thoroughfare which can pass as a street, there are a dozen or two alleys, footpaths, shadowy recesses, and blind holes. And as Shakespeare said, there are land rats and there are water rats." So Wilson had been told, I'm going to transition to the next section here, but Wilson had been told that there were German spy rings on the waterfront and really throughout the United States. And for both moral reasons and for political reasons, he refused to engage the U.S. in any kind of espionage. He simply believed, even naively, that it was beneath American to sort of stoop to such levels, not really understanding that it had become something that was commonplace in Europe, where the borders were much more sort of porous. So this next section lays out some of his reasoning, which ultimately left the country so vulnerable. President Wilson had not planned on making foreign policy a focal point of his administration. But within 18 months of his inauguration, the war in Europe would consume his attention. The idea of joining the fight sickened him. He said during a speech in 1915, "Americans must have a consciousness that is different from the consciousness of every other nation in the world. The example of America must be a special example. The example of America must be the example, not merely of peace because it will not fight, but peace because peace is the healing and elevating influence of the world, and strife is not." While England, France, and Germany cultivated advanced Secret Service operations, America's spy agencies, which included the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Military Intelligence Division, and the Secret Service, were still in their early stages. A few years after he left office, Wilson made a speech poking fun at how ill-informed he was when it came to espionage. Quote, "I not only did not know it until we got into the war, but I did not believe it when I was told that it was true, that Germany was not the only country that maintained a secret service. Every country in Europe maintained it. Of course, America did too, but in 1915, compared to its European counterparts, the U.S. Secret Service appeared to be no more sophisticated than a small-town sheriff's office. Many Americans felt the same as Wilson. Spies were a European invention, the product of too many borders and long-standing animus between countries. The security of peacetime, the feeling that the United States was in danger only when at war, ran deep. Because the U.S. was neutral, Wilson believed Germany wouldn't infiltrate his country with secret agents. Because he wanted the U.S. to remain neutral, he ignored that it had, even as the evidence mounted. After learning late in 1914 that the German embassy was loosely tied to a passport forgery business, Wilson wrote to his Attorney General, quote, "I hope that you will have the matter looked into thoroughly, but that, at the same time, you will have all possible precautions taken that no hint of it may become public until it materializes into something upon which we have to act." In July of 1915, Anne Seward, the niece of William Seward, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, warned Wilson of a German man she had seen at a party and known for several years who was now introducing himself under a false name. Seward wrote, "His utterances are distinctly offensive and his threats alarming. His national prominence in Germany and his high military rank, coupled with his various aliases and his frequent change of address, give rise to uncomfortable suspicions." Despite this story, Seward's testimony was ignored. So, Wilson turned a blind eye while the U.S. was infiltrated with spies, and his aides were a bit more practical. They were driven by Seward's testimony. They were driven by evidence from the phony passport operation. The Secret Service actually did begin tailing visible German spies on the New York waterfront. But this didn't get rid of the German agents. It really only forced them to move their operation much further south, and they ended up in Baltimore, which was another German-American stronghold. And there were 3 German agents. There was an American businessman named Paul Hilken. There was an American who had turned into a spy for Germany named Fred Herman. And then there was a German merchant marine who was interned in the United States when but because of Wilson's policies of neutrality. And his name was Frederick Hinch. And so early in 1916, while Hinch was interned in the U.S., Hilken and Herman met with high-ranking German intelligence agents in Berlin. They had traveled to Berlin and visited with many of the military officers there. So the following excerpt shows how their meeting, after they met in Germany, it shows their meeting with Hinch, Hilken and Herman's meeting, after returning from Berlin, and detailing their plans to attack the United States. Herman beat Hilken to Baltimore from Germany by several days. While awaiting Hilken's arrival, Herman stayed at the Hotel Emerson, one of the most regal and ornate lodgings in Baltimore. Then, one cool late March morning, Herman went to check in with Hilkin's office. As he opened the door, he recognized Hilkin standing in the front. They shook hands, greeting each other with a familiarity born of sharing a secret. Hilkin then told one of his staff to find Frederick Hinch and bring him back to the office immediately. "Let's go upstairs," Hilkin said to Herman. Herman and Hilkin walked up a flight of stairs towards an office. Almost as soon as they reached the top, Hinch came sprinting up the stairs behind them. For 6 months, Hinch had been interned in Baltimore along with the crew of his steamship. He was anxious to strike back at America. Once upstairs, Herman put his briefcase on a table. Inside were 2 boxes, about 3 inches wide, 3 inches long, and 1 inch deep. Both were heavily wrapped in brown tissue paper. He pulled one box out of his briefcase, unfurled the paper, and opened the lid. The bombs were in tightly packed rows. "I gave about half to Hinch," Herman said years later. Hinch then handed Herman a piece of paper, listing powder plants, screw works, and munitions depots. Black Tom was included under its official title, Jersey Terminal. There were close to 20 entries on the page. Hinch told Herman to look over the list and pick out the places he thought he could handle on his own, and put a check by them. Herman handed the list back to Hinch and said, "I'll see what is up at these places, and you see what is up at the others." He left Black Tom blank. "That was Hinch's," Herman said. "I had to leave him something." At around 12:45 a.m. on July 30th, 1916, a captain of one of the barges docked at Black Tom returned from a night on the town in Newark. It was 65 degrees, a beautiful evening, and he slowly strolled along the sea wall past dozens of cars and barges filled with hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition. A soft breeze blew in from the harbor. In the distance, he could see the Statue of Liberty. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He spotted a pier patrolman, and the two stopped to chat. About 5 minutes into the conversation, the guard noticed something odd over the captain's shoulder. "There's a fire!" he screamed. The captain turned around. Shooting over the tops of the railroad cars he had just walked past were bright white and orange flames. The captain would say years later it was burning from the interior of the car, flaming out around the top and side edges of the door and up in the air. But there was no fire on the ground. The guard ran to pull the fire alarm. When he turned back, he could hear popping sounds from the direction of the fire. The shells were exploding. By the time the Jersey City Fire Department pulled up to Black Tom at 1:20 a.m., the barge was a furnace so hot the men didn't get near it. One of the firemen attached his hose to a hydrant, but when he turned the nozzle, there was no water pressure. Shells were now popping in all directions. The Jersey City fire chief ordered his men, unable to water down the blaze, to pull back. At 2:08 a.m., the Johnson 17, a barge carrying 100,000 pounds of TNT and 25,000 detonators, exploded. It was like the discharge of a great cannon, wrote the New York Times. A doctor who was treating immigrants on Ellis Island and watched the destruction through a set of opera glasses said, "A great light went up. It seemed to me that when I stood as if it filled the whole sky, not only in front of my vision, but everywhere. And from the great mass of fire, there seemed to shoot thousands of little sparks. As I ran into the house, fragments began to fall, thousands of pieces of wood, pieces of sheet metal, and heavy, muddy rain." Firemen standing on the edge of the yard were actually blown out of their shoes. Shells now launched towards the sea. Bullets flew through the air. The explosions were constant, reverberating throughout lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Jersey City, lighting up the skyline. The Johnson 17 had completely disappeared. The thunder and shock of the first explosion devastated almost all of Jersey City. City Hall lost every window and glass door, and the ceilings of the Assembly, Chamber, and the courtroom caved in. The stained glass windows of the city's most beautiful church, St. Patrick's, were blown out, as were the windows at All Saints Church. For 5 blocks along Ocean Avenue, one of the town's main arteries, every shop window was gone. At police headquarters, part of the ceiling collapsed on the head of the lieutenant dispatching men to the scene. At 2:40 a.m., another massive explosion occurred, sending a pillar of flame shooting towards the sky and engulfing the yard in fire. The New York City Fire Department hurried a fireboat to the scene, hoping to help the hundreds of people living in barges buoyed to the northwest of the Black Tom Peninsula. But the bullets flew so fast and so frequently, the firemen were reduced to lying on their stomach, protected by the boat's steel railing, and aiming their hoses blindly over the bow. Across the harbor in downtown Manhattan, windows in the new skyscrapers lining Broadway, Wall, Broad, and every other street were shattered, including every pane in the building that housed J.P. Morgan and Company. Further uptown, the windows at the library on 42nd Street were blown out, as were the windows in nearly every store along Fifth Avenue. At the corner of 42nd and 5th, 10 fire trucks, all responding to different alarms throughout the city, were gridlocked. In Times Square, the explosion caused a water main beneath 42nd Street and 6th Avenue to burst, flooding 4 square blocks. The guests at the Knickerbocker and other upscale hotels gathered in the streets, running barefoot over the shattered window panes that littered the pavement. Police frantically blew their whistles and ran into the stores, assuming that the windows had been blown by safecrackers. When they realized no one was inside, they commandeered taxicabs and raced downtown, chasing the glow of Black Tom. The harbor burned a bright orange, and the rat-a-tat-tat of exploding gunpowder made people feel as if they were witness to a battlefield. Outside of Manhattan, chaos reigned as well. The Brooklyn Bridge shook from the shockwaves, and the tubes under the Hudson River connecting New York to Hoboken rolled with the blast. Phone lines between New York and New Jersey went dead. Headstones in Jersey City were upturned. Shrapnel tore into the Statue of Liberty and pelted the foundations of buildings packed with immigrants on nearby Ellis Island. People as far south as Philadelphia felt the ground shake and thought they were in the middle of an earthquake. In Maryland, phone lines to police were jammed with people concerned about weird vibrations they felt in their homes. There was no pattern to the chaos. No one knew what had happened. No one knew what was happening. No one felt safe. 5 days later, on August 4th, it was a perfect night to throw a party in New York. Breezy and clear and softly lit by a late summer moon. At the corner of Broadway and 44th Street, the Astor Hotel had an elaborate roof garden overlooking Times Square. It gave Hilken and his men an opportunity to gaze down upon the masses and congratulate themselves for the secrets they kept. Before they sat down to dinner, Hinch approached Hilken. The two had developed a good working relationship. Hinch did the dirty work, Hilken paid the bills, and this was payday. With their backs to the rest of the party, Hinch said to his boss, "How about that bonfire?" Hilken began to press for details about who actually planted the bombs, but Hinch brushed him off. "It's better," he said, "if you don't know too much." Hilken didn't disagree. The less he knew, the safer he'd be. He casually handed Hinch 2 $1,000 bills, his reward for arranging the sabotage at Black Tom Island. It would be nearly a quarter of a century as America readied itself for a second world war with Germany before their secrets would be revealed. That's it. Who's got questions? First one is always scariest. Yes. So the question is, and I'll repeat the questions because I think for folks in the back who might not be able to hear, but the question was, how did it ultimately come out? So what happened was, after World War I ended, Germany and the United States set up what was called a mixed claims commission. It was a panel that had American and German judges, and their job was to settle all claims for damage that businesses and citizens had against either country from the war. And so there were about 12,000 cases. And all of them were settled relatively quickly and easily. One case lingered, and that was Black Tom Island. And so there was a lawyer named Amos Peaslee, who was based in New Jersey, who took on the case really for a private railroad, for the Lehigh Valley Railroad, which is who had the train cars that sort of were filled with the ammunition. And he ended up taking up a partner at a firm in New York, and the man assigned to the case was John McCloy. And so Germany, successively through multiple administrations, always refused to settle this case because they felt like it would have been tantamount to admitting that they had enticed the U.S. into war. And so McCloy and Peaslee were constantly sort of investigating, and they were going through old files, and they were from the southern tip of South America to Berlin to Washington, D.C., trying to sort of put together the clues that would prove Germany had done this. And the Mixed Claims Commission continued to hear the case over the years. And this went on through the end of the Weimar Republic, the beginning of Nazi Germany. McCloy, they thought they had a settlement. McCloy had gone to Berlin for the 1936 Olympics, and had a meeting with Goring, and Goring, they all thought it was settled. And then when McCloy left Germany, before he left Germany, he was invited to sit with Hitler in the box at the stadium, at the Olympic Stadium. And they had all the soldiers sort of goose-stepping, and they had the opera playing and the lights and sort of going around like the floodlights. Sort of McCloy felt like they were putting on this great show of strength. And McCloy left Germany realizing they're never going to settle this. Like, they have no interest. This was sort of their clue that it's not going to happen. Ultimately, 3 years later in 1939, at this point, Germany is becoming occupied with sort of invasions throughout Europe, and has decided that McCloy and Peaslee at this point have really put together like the case. And they have proven to both the German judges and the American judges of the Mixed Claims Commission that Germany had planted the bombs that blew up Black Tom Island. And Nazi Germany at that time sort of said, we denounce the Mixed Claims Commission, we do not agree with anything that is said. And so it was settled that they had done it, but they refused to acknowledge it. Ultimately, in 1953, there was a settlement after World War II. There was a settlement that Germany was to pay $50 million in reparations. Much of that money was taken from money that was sort of already in American accounts, that was German money. They were just going to withhold it from going back to them. What became interesting is that because of McCloy's work on Black Tom, he came to the attention of Henry Stimson, who became FDR's Secretary of War. And they knew they were entering into what would be a hostile relationship with Germany, and they knew they wanted somebody on their team who truly understood sort of German strategy and German philosophy and Nazi strategy and philosophy. So after the case in 1940, after this case had sort of unofficially been settled, Stimson asked McCloy to leave private practice and to become his Assistant Secretary of War. And so they did that, and then McCloy was a part of the FDR administration. And FDR, going back for a second, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1916, and so he was aware of sort of Black Tom Island and the Wilson's administration's policy of neutrality and sort of the subsequent steps that they sort of avoided to go into war until they really had to. So then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. 6 weeks later, McCloy, Stimson, and FDR are sitting in the Oval Office. And FDR has decided they're going to, with counsel from McCloy and Stimson, that they're going to intern Japanese American citizens living on the west coast of the United States. And fear had really gripped the United States at that time, and it was not unlike what it was happening in 1916 before the U.S. had entered the war. And so McCloy looks at, or FDR looks at McCloy and says, "You're going to be in charge of interning the Japanese." And then he says to him, "We don't want another Black Tom Island." And sort of the repercussions of that event, carried forth years later into the internment of the Japanese, and which is sort of a landmark moment in American history, not in a good way. And McCloy became an interesting character because after that, Truman named him the first High Commissioner to Germany. He was in charge of rebuilding Germany after World War II, and he went on to become known as the chairman of the establishment. He was the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the chairman of Chase Bank. He was an advisor to every president from FDR through Truman through the first George Bush. And he died during George Bush's administration. But he became sort of this powerful figure, and it all started with his investigation of Black Tom Island. I want to go back to one element of that. In 1916, I mentioned sort of there was a real fear gripping the United States. German Americans at that time, there were stories in the newspaper, regularly, that as soon as the U.S. entered the war, German Americans had direction from the Kaiser to mobilize a militia against American citizens. And it was so bad that restaurants started calling sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage. And they started calling hamburgers Liberty Sandwiches. German Americans were no longer allowed to serve in the Red Cross because there was a fear that they would grind up glass and spread that into bandages. They stopped teaching German in the public schools in California, and on and on and on. And it was fascinating because up until that point, sort of in that high peak of immigration to the United States, German Americans were sort of lauded as being the one ethnic group that had assimilated themselves the most into American culture. And so, we saw it in World War II. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of that kind of rhetoric today, sort of in the presidential campaign. Teddy Roosevelt at the time, he was a staunch opponent of Wilson's policies. Barnstormed around the country preaching against hyphenated Americans and the fears that German Americans put forth into the hearts of American citizens. Other questions? I know someone else had their hand up. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was, how did the government suppress a lot of the information they got? And so, there were small acts of sabotage beginning as early as 1915 throughout the United States. There were these random and mysterious explosions at munitions depots all over New Jersey, all over Delaware, all over Pennsylvania, spread throughout the country. There had been that phony passport operation that was going on, and two of the German emissaries who were running it were kicked out of the United States because of this operation that they were running. There were sort of signs along the way that there were German acts of espionage that were happening within the United States, but the government was very careful to sort of make sure that anytime anything happened, it was sort of couched as an isolated incident and not something that was part of a broader plan to try to bring the United States into war or to try to act aggressively against the United States. Wilson, in 1916, was campaigning as the president who had kept us out of war, and campaigning obviously successfully. And so even when Black Tom happened, immediately the next morning, not within 24 hours of the explosion, the Bureau of Investigations immediately told the New York Times that this was an accident. And Wilson was quoted as saying, "I am not going to," he was planning his acceptance of the nomination. for president. And he said, I am not going to be bothered with something that happened at a private railroad terminal. So until the Zimmerman telegram in 1917, it was an active attempt to make sure that nothing that was happening that sort of looked like a pattern of German aggression could be conceived that way by the American public, so there wasn't a push to go into war beyond sort of, Roosevelt and his military preparedness movement, which, by the way, John McCloy, who went on to investigate the case, was a huge follower of Roosevelt's preparedness movement and had been on a college campus for one of Roosevelt's big speeches. Yes, sir. Oh. So the first part was just a very nice compliment from me. So thank you. And the second part is, how were the people who were sort of interned in the ships communicating, with each other? There was a vast spy network in the United States because there were so many Germans that were interned here, and because there were so many German Americans who were sympathetic to the Kaiser's cause in Germany. And, they were funneling tremendous amounts of money back to Germany through the embassies here in the United States. And so there were safe houses. And, one of the safe houses that I write about was on 15th Street, 123 West 15th Street in the city, by a German opera singer named Martha Held, who had these fabulous parties for German sailors, German German citizens who were interned here, German sailors who were interned here, German citizens, members of the embassies, etc. And they would all be there and congregate and share information, and then they would sort of web out and under different plans of attack and different conversations and sort of different strategies. But it wasn't that hard for them to communicate because the people at the highest levels were sort of in the conversation and then funneling direction to the rest of the people who were the foot soldiers. And because they were all sort of in close quarters, and the U.S. was paying sort of nominal attention to where they were, and there are also so many of them they couldn't keep track of them all. That was, the policy of neutrality was meant to keep German ships from being able to go back into the war, but the problem was that it kept all of the German sailors in the United States. So that was a huge detriment for the U.S. You had a follow-up question, sir, in the front here. There were, the question is, were there a lot of people killed? There were 6 people killed officially, including a baby in Jersey City that was thrown from its crib. But there were literally thousands of people who were living in boats, who were undocumented, that were assumed to have just turned to dust, like those boats disappeared. And so it's where a lot of the New York City firemen were trying to get to, sort of all these people in these boats that were sort of docked in the harbor, and they're, coming to the United States, and they're gone. And nobody would have ever known who they were. I wonder if anyone has way in the back. I just want to make sure. So what is the status of Black Tom Island is the question now. It's gone. It disappeared. If you go down to, it really is the southernmost point of Liberty State Park. There's sort of where it rounds and curves. You're looking at the back of the Statue of Liberty. It feels like you could throw a football and hit it. That's where Black Tom Island used to be. And those piers are all gone, and the island itself is all gone, and it's sort of what's left of it, and sort of that area is now the park. It's very nice. Yes, sir. To the 3 guys who Hinch went back to Germany. Herman moved to Germany, and Hilken stayed in the United States. And he was a guy who, his family ran the North German Lloyd Shipping Company. And when the war started, that was one of the reasons why he was so interested in helping Germany, is because his livelihood was tied up in being loyal to Germany. And so from a legal perspective, nothing ever happened to him. I mean, he went on to live his life, and he had a family and sort of lived in Baltimore. But he became one of the key witnesses who corroborated a lot of the evidence that John McCloy and Amos Peasley were able to find through various documents. Yes. So the first question is that he had heard the arm of the Statue of Liberty was damaged, and that's why it was closed off. The second question is any documentation about damage to Hoboken. The second question first. I don't remember coming across anything specific about damage to Hoboken, largely focused on Jersey City, given its proximity to Black Tom Island. The first question, yes, that's exactly why it was closed off. It was closed off the next day, and you used to be able to go all the way to the top there, and you have never been able to since then. And when Lee Iacocca sort of did that huge refurbishing effort for the Statue of Liberty, a lot of it was because to repair the shrapnel damage to the Statue of Liberty from the explosion at Black Tom. Yes. They called it Black Tom Island because if you looked at it on a topographical map, they thought it looked like a black cat that had its back arched. And so, the workers just sort of gave it the nickname Black Tom Island. Last question, I think, right? Okay, sorry. I'm not sure what time we're going till, so I just wanted to...
We can do a few more.
Okay. Yes, sir. So the question is, can we draw any conclusions to sort of help with what we are facing with terrorism today? I don't know that there's anything in terms of practical investigative advice anybody could take from sort of what happened 100 years ago and the subsequent investigation. But I am always struck, every single day, especially during this election season, how so much of the rhetoric, I think I mentioned this before, is so similar to what we were hearing in 1916 and so similar to sort of the fear that people felt and the way that various groups tried to prey on that fear for a variety of political reasons. And so the lessons that I keep seeing pop up are sort of, even as you extend it to the internment of the Japanese, is sort of being very thoughtful and very careful about the language you use and the application of that language against real policy. Yes. So the question was, how significant a factor was this into us eventually entering the war? I don't think it was a factor at all. I think that by the time we entered into war, which was, almost a year later, so much more had been happening. The war had been progressing at such a pace. The Zimmerman telegram was really sort of the factor where it was clear Germany was trying to collude and sort of make an aggressive attempt to invade, that ultimately was the tipping point that Wilson could no longer ignore. Yes? So at the time, they estimated it was $20 million, which I feel like I recently did a conversion. It was like, $450 million today or something like that, $500 million today. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was there, given all the damage, was there stoppage in Europe support afterwards? Jersey side and Europe side?
The question is, was there stoppage? Did they stop bringing boats in and out? I mean, temporarily, but it still continued to be, one of the busiest and most important harbors in the country. I mean, I read in the excerpt about John Mitchell sort of being afraid of what would happen, and this is the closest it came, but it still didn't stop sort of commerce because people needed their stuff. I think we're done. Oh no, I don't know. I thought you were asking a question. Okay, go ahead.
So, do you think, it's all guessing, but an educated guess, do you think if there was more loss of life, that it would have been harder to cover this up and it might have gotten us into the war earlier?
I think if there had been more loss of life, it would have lingered longer in the consciousness, and it probably would have been a story that people had heard more, and generationally, it would have been something that was passed down, something that was talked about in history books, things like that. I think anytime you have a massive loss of life, then it's something that is going to sort of grab people's attention a little bit more. So certainly I think that was a factor. All right. Thank you all very much.